Hello there, this is Chris from Foundry, and today we'll be looking at Phoebe Bridgers' second album, Punisher. You could view this as her fourth album, with the two collaborations, Boy Genius and Better of Living Community Centre, sitting in between these two solo efforts. But this album marks a real return to the quiet uneasiness of Stranger in the Alps, but there's also a real sense of progression here as well. Let's get into it. This album has a lot of cinematic energy. It's deliberately filmic. It opens with a track called DVD Menu, which sets the tone and feel of the album and calls on these strings that have this existential power and feel like something you might have heard on the Kid A era of Radiohead, something like You and Whose Army, that sort of feel. Thematically, Phoebe's calling on themes of obsession and longing on this album, and she uses linear storytelling combined with this snapshot imagery, these little vignettes, some of which feel intensely personal. The more I've listened to this album, I've started to think of it as a sort of dark fairy tale or some sort of nightmare storybook, but it also has these touches of humour that we've come to expect of Phoebe's work. And speaking of what we expect of Phoebe's work, for me it's two things. It's a certain intimacy and honesty of storytelling, combined with these dark pools, these moments of darkness that sort of put the listener on edge. Things like in the track Halloween, we have the line, "They killed a fan down by the stadium, was only visiting but they beat him to death." And in Moonsong we have the "We hate tears in heaven" moment. And also in Moonsong, the "When you saw the dead little bird you started crying, but you know the killer doesn't understand." These moments are dark, but they're honest and they really land. They draw you into the record and create this intrigue, or in storytelling terms, this texture to the work that really pulls you in. This sort of writing will feel immediately recognisable to anyone who knows Phoebe's first album, Stranger in the Alps, but here it feels a little bit more deliberate. To put that more clearly, everything here feels slightly less forced. Not that it felt forced in Stranger in the Alps, that's a fantastic album, but everything here feels slightly more human, slightly more true, and allows the listener to have just that little bit more access, particularly on the first listening. I think Stranger in the Alps required a few listens to understand what Phoebe was saying, but here the delivery is much stronger, much more direct to the listener. There are also some really prescient moments of introspection on this album, like in Saviour Complex, the opening line, "Emotional affair, overly sincere," and the whole of the final track, I know the end. That sort of semi-fourth wall break, conceptually at least. There's some real inward looking from Phoebe here that's interesting. Overall, looking at Phoebe's work, this album is definitely closest to Stranger in the Alps than it is to the two collaboration albums, and she really wears her influence on her sleeve again, and proudly so, and I think that's a great thing. I think if art inspires you that much, show it. Now, looking at the structure and production of the record, let's start with the structure because it's tied to the production, I would say consciously. The album kicks off with that instrumental track and then Garden Song, which is this fairly low-key, bassy track with Phoebe's uneasy vocals sitting on top of it, kind of like above the mist of the music, and her vocals feel almost like this warning, this uneasy handshake at the start of the record. The production here is intimate, the staging is close, and the tone of it is introverted. It's almost an internal track. It's very personal. And then the second track hits, Kyoto, which is one of the tracks we heard before the album, and it kicks off this almost machined beat that drives like a train on tracks. It's relentless, and it leans sort of on the treble side of the spectrum, and there's sort of a slight sharpness to the production of it. And given the bass heavy sort of soft opening, this kick feels like It's deliberate, it gets the record going. But then straight after that, we go straight back down the hill to two much more quiet, melodic tracks in Punisher and Halloween, both of which share a similar vibe to Garden Song and serve to just quieten things down a little bit. And then we're straight back up with the next track, Chinese Satellite, down again with Moon Song, up with ICU, down, up. You get the picture. It's very well paced, it's very consciously paced. And the result of that is that it engages you. There are no real lulls here. You start with the slower moment and you're let in, and then you get a kick, and then you get a moment to breathe, and you get another kick and a moment to breathe. It feels, as I said, very deliberate, perhaps a little too predictable, you could argue, but it certainly keeps you engaged throughout the whole listen. Some of the cuts are a little bit more fleshed out, in my opinion, but the record as a whole is very well paced. So let's look at the ups and the downs of this album. And for me, there's only one significant down, and that's that several of the tracks, Kyoto, Chinese Satellite, and the final track, I Know the End, towards the death of the cut, they get a little bit messy, and I think it's deliberate. It's certainly deliberate because there's a good storytelling reason for it. But if you're listening to any of those songs in isolation, it can feel a little bit almost unfinished, which is perhaps unfair, but again, in isolation, they feel a little bit messy. Having said that, that storytelling reason, those moments of chaos prepare you for that final track, I Know the End, where the chaos works, the chaos has real power to it. And if those chaotic collapses weren't there elsewhere in the record at those key moments, that final moment would feel completely out of place on this record. And so having those raucous moments on Kyoto, on Chinese Satellite, and in one or two other places means that that ending feels right. But again, in isolation, maybe they feel a bit messy. When it comes to the highlights, the track Graceland 2, for me, is its own little masterpiece. It has these pin-sharp instrumentals that sort of dance around each other. The opening line of no longer a danger to herself or others is just so thick with mystery. The writing is very good. And we get a line a little bit later, which is, she could do anything that she wants to do. And that's so good because you sense that it means the opposite. And then over all of this, you get this this sort of spectre of LA and Tom Petty sort of sitting in the musical air, and it's just, the track it's just pristine. Elsewhere, I think Garden Song is one of the best examples of Phoebe's trademark vignette storytelling, and I think Savior Complex is just a simple, beautiful melodic track. And then we get this last track, I Know the End, which is different to anything else here. It's a track of two acts. The first one feels a lot like the quieter tracks on the album, like Garden Song and Savior Complex and Moon Song. And then the last part, it builds. The drums kick in, you get that beat, it drives, and then it feels more like the upbeat tracks, but with this epic production. And because it has those two elements, it ties the two dimensions of the album together and makes it feel like a cohesive whole. I think without this track, this album would not be as feel like a single entity like it does. It feels like an ending, and it knows it. Before we wrap things up here, I want to talk about the physical release of the album, because if you buy this on record, you get inside. For a start, there's a blue version, there's a red version. I love that kind of indie store exclusive. I think it's great. But aside from that, in every single release, you get this lyric book. Lyric books usually not a big deal. You know, you look at them once, you put them away. This thing has these illustrations by Chris Riddell, who's illustrated books before, and his work has such a distinctive style that you sit on your second or third listen of this album with this booklet in front of you, which has gorgeous typesetting in it as well. And it adds something to the listening experience. And I've not really seen anyone talk about this booklet, but I do think it adds this extra dimension to listening to the album. And it was really appreciated by me. I'd love to see more of that. So, wrapping things up, I have a lot of love for this album. It has this irresistible cinematic quality, and it flows with this dark energy. The production ranges from intimate to epic. It's structured very well, keeps the listener engaged, and that poetry from Phoebe is just witty and sharp and dark. I don't rate albums on any kind of scale because I don't think that it's appropriate to do that with art. I know some people do, and that's great, but for me, I'll just say this, that if you enjoy story-driven, honest writing in your music, this is worth a listen. If you know Phoebe's work, you know what to expect, but there is a real step forward here. Particularly that last track, I Know the End, feels like it's hinting at what's to come, and it's an exciting future. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this review. The next one I'll be doing will probably be Taylor Swift's album, which just dropped, Folklore, and I cannot stop listening to that Bon Iver track. It is just in my head. So that'll be the next one, and if you want to see that, please hit the notification bell below. Oh, and if you do end up picking out Punisher physically, and you manage to get one of the special editions, send me a picture on Instagram or Twitter, because my copies of those are still in their cellophane, but I really want to see just how they turned out. So thank you for watching again, and I'll catch you next time.